The way that characters speak to each other in Persuasion has complexity similar to what we've seen in the free, indirect style of the main narrative. Even when there are quotation marks around the words so that one character appears to address another directly, the spoken words might have little to do with the explicit subject of the conversation or the person ostensibly being addressed. There is often subtext or a meaning beneath the literal meaning of the words. Again, I rely on the wisdom of another scholar to assist us. Howard Babb identifies two trends in Jane Austen's dialogue. One he calls metaphorical indirection. By indirection, he means that the words spoken are often not intended for the person to whom they are addressed. Consider the point at which Mary makes a cruel revelation. Captain Wentworth is not very gallant by you, Anne, though he was so attentive to me. Henrietta asked him what he thought of you when they went away, and he said you were so altered he should not have known you. Left subsequently to her own thoughts, Anne reflects, I quote, Frederick Wentworth had used such words or something like them, but without an idea they would be carried round to her. Anne is naive here. The whole point is that Wentworth knows the words would be relayed to her. As readers, we understand this small, gossipy world of persuasion. It's one in which a controversial statement is certain to be related to other parties. And this communicative grapevine is exploited by some characters as a means to wound others, as Wentworth does here. To integrate these kinds of social machinations is one of Austen's innovations as a novelist. Another observation that Howard Babb makes is that at times Austen's characters, and I quote Babb here, pretend to talk of the literal situation, while indeed they treat it metaphorically, thus betraying their most intense feelings. So not only do some characters speak with the intention of being heard by a person other than the one they are addressing, but they can also speak in ways that express feelings far more significant than the literal subject of the conversation. One process is conscious while the other is potentially unconscious. People can imagine they are talking about quite abstract ideas while unwittingly revealing profound sentiments that they might not even realize they have. Several times in Persuasion, characters betray deep emotion when they are talking about quite general ideas. Sometimes it's conscious and sometimes it appears not to be conscious. So conversations that start out seeming light and inconsequential suddenly gain emotional charge. One example is the discussion of whether sailors' wives should go to sea. Women at sea? Are ships comfortable? Are they suitably equipped for ladies? The stakes are raised, and the conversation becomes a measure of whether a man is considerate and therefore suitable as a husband, or whether a woman is fussy and therefore a disagreeable companion. A feminist strain creeps in as Sophia Croft resists her brother Frederick's implication that a man should be the judge of whether a woman belongs at sea. Another episode we might consider is the walk to Winthrop in chapter 10. Louisa tells Wentworth, I quote, "If I loved a man, I should always be with him. Nothing should ever separate us, and I'd rather be overturned by him than driven safely by anyone else." Aside from the distracting sexual connotations of a woman being overturned by a man, what stands out is the force of Louisa's delivery. She speaks with enthusiasm, the narrator tells us. Wentworth, in return, exclaims, "I honour you." There's such force behind these declarations that we know that in coded terms we are broaching subjects more important than drivers and carriages. There are intimations of marital vows in the ruminations on commitment. These themes are clear to us, but they are subtextual, very serious issues that lie beneath the surface of what is being said. This kind of realism may be obvious to us as modern readers and viewers, but it was innovative for its time to reproduce these psychological layers in a novel, still, as I said, a relatively young cultural form. I want to finish up by looking at the climax of the novel, which ties together various things I've said about narrative. At this point, Anne talks to Captain Harville about Benwick, who has now overcome his old grief sufficiently to form an attachment to Louisa Musgrove. Here, Harville and Anne discuss whether a person is likely to forget lost love. The key ingredient, of course, is that Wentworth is within earshot. Anne says, apparently in detached terms, that a woman's passion would be an unbearable burden for a man. but what she means is sufficient for Wentworth listening in to drop his pen. To sum up on this week, I've spent some time trying to encapsulate Jane Austen's narrative style of free, indirect speech. It's a mode of delivery that filters the thoughts of various characters and adopts their voices in the main narrative in a manner that I thought might be likened to ventriloquism. I mentioned polyphony to acknowledge the sheer number of voices that Austen represents in short sequences of narrative, and I called attention to the agility with which the narrative moves between those voices. Then I focused on two traits in Austen's dialogue. The first of these is the tendency for characters to intend their words to be heard by a person other than the person explicitly being addressed in a given conversation, an important technique for its realism and for its requirement that Austen arrange the characters in a certain way so that they can overhear and report to each other. The second trait I mentioned was a tendency for characters to treat the literal subject of a conversation metaphorically, that any matter under discussion might represent very deep sentiments. When characters experience this, it can cause the emotional pitch of a particular exchange to escalate dramatically. All of these attributes, I think, are evidence of a psychological realism in Austen's work, realism in accordance with the insistent historical reference in the novel's last sentences. Persuasion doesn't just tell a story, but represents humanity in its dithering complexity.